Hello! Today I'm taking a brief look at a game series that since its first release has proved a compelling and innovative exploration of the sandbox gaming genre, and an ambitious, morally ambiguous approach to themes and gameplay that upon its initial release back in 2000 pitched it firmly in the R-rated remit of video gaming. From its relatively murky origins as a quirky PC exclusive around 2 decades ago, Hitman swiftly entered the console market with Hitman 2 Silent Assassin in 2002, and since then has built a consistent and dedicated niche audience, which ushers us into the present day. In this episode, I'd like to explore the characters, the narrative, the themes, and the ongoing successes of the Hitman series, which continues to prove one of the more replayable and memorable gaming experiences that I've had over the years. Though it's prudent to note before we begin that I've played every Hitman game to date, but I haven't touched on the peripheral and ancillary, content such as novels, mini games, and these little releases that extend the mythology around Hitman. So, as that's not something I'm engaged with, I won't be considering them as much as the core games. So, jumping right in, Hitman proves innovative and unique in a number of ways, not least because it was an early proponent of open-world explorative gameplay, but also because it focuses on non-linearity and player-determinate solutions to levels, which persists to this day and is what I'd like to focus on first. The multifaceted non-linear approach is a wholly empowering interactive experience that makes the game both unique to each gamer and also infinitely replayable as you attempt to refine your discretion as 47. Indeed, the most recent instalments of the series have capitalised upon the tangent conclusions you can reach, with incentivised opportunities and challenges highlighted for players to work towards. Now, this approach often makes for a somewhat paradoxical gaming experience, because while Hitman has historically rewarded discretion and seamless unnoticed kills, it often rewards the player, and the better you perform, the more discreet you are, you tend to unlock loud automatic firearms for use across subsequent levels, which is somewhat contrary to the aims and intentions of 47 and the game trajectory and the mechanics of the game. However, to contend this idea, it is the beauty of Hitman that, despite discretion being strongly advised, the ability to hole yourself up and attempt to outgun an entire level worth of security guards, or force your way through a level towards a target by just shooting everyone that comes into your line of fire, rather than sneaking around in air vents and things like this, the sheer freedom of choice within the confines of the game map, and these options that are open to you, is what makes Hitman the exceptional game experience and the exceptional series that it is to this day. As such, where I've variously heard the game described as a shooter or an action game or a stealth game, breaking Hitman down to its constituent parts with various player-driven approaches within a confined level, I'd essentially call it a puzzle game, because it relies on logic, problem-solving and adaptive learning as much as it does staying out of sight or shooting people. The ability to adopt disguises, procure weaponry, exploit overheard conversations, and facilitate fatal accidents are merely analogues to puzzle pieces that fit together to reach a desired conclusion in the form of an assassination. So, with this gameplay framework in mind, let's briefly return to the experimental origins and dubiously received Hitman, codename 47, which, looking back on it, is often laughed at by fans because, the graphics and the writing and the dialogue is quite hammy to the modern eye, but nonetheless it served as an ambitious blueprint upon which later games were refined and built upon in terms of gameplay and story. IO Interactive introduced many of the renowned traits in this initial title, such as adopting disguises, the ragdoll dynamics for dragging dead bodies and shooting people down, and penalties based on indiscreet or civilian harming actions. And indeed, the focus on finances and penalties for consistently bad gameplay can actually bankrupt 47 in this first game, leading to a game over, which I think it was a big criticism on its initial release, and I don't think they've iterated that aspect of gameplay since. But it was interesting because it does almost force a player down this route of being discreet and, being economic with weaponry, for example, because you have to purchase them, prior to each level. The loosely consistent story arc of 47's starting life as a test subject is also established from the outset in the first game, with the onboarding and the introduction to controls performed in an escape sequence from the sanatorium. And this is something that's also revisited in Hitman Contracts, which picks up towards the end of the first game and continues this sort of consistent narrative, throughout. Looking beyond the first game to the broader story, the developers have made a decent stab of making a consistent arc above and beyond the episodic, isolated killings that take place in each game. And this is a difficult thing to do because the scope for narrative and character development during missions where you have to kill a contracted, unrelated target is quite minimal. But from the outset, they've attempted to thread the disparate killings together into a consistent arc, in the form of trying to rescue your Italian priest friend in the second game, for example, to all of the hits in the first game being genetic benefactors to 47's cloning process. And, we're inadvertently assassinating a linked series of targets, which incidentally was something that they reiterated for the 2016 reboot, Hitman, wherein we are assassinating a linked group of people on behalf of the Shadow Client. So, off the back of this, and, the gameplay format and the difficulty of telling a story through this, many have criticised the Hitman narrative arc as confusing, in part due to this, the aforementioned self-contained nature of the levels, but also because the wider story and the macro events of things tend to operate between elusive, unseen organisations and entities, primarily the ICA, who are 47's employers, with whom he has an often dubious allegiance. But periodically we have other Illuminati-esque clandestine, organisations and antagonists such as Ort-Meyer, the franchise, and more recently Providence and the Partners. And these organisations, along with others that dip in, such as the FBI, for example, they seem to have small cutscenes in shadowy, darkened rooms with ambiguous characters that we can't see. So it doesn't always add much clarity as to what's going on, or kind of reveal consistent characters, therein. So my take on this, and what I've noticed over the years, is that yes, the plots are often murky and unresolved or ongoing, but taking a step back and looking at the narrative arc broadly, the organisations and people that we contend with throughout the series serve a greater purpose than being esoteric, episodic obstacles to overcome, because collectively, across each game, they have developed the characterisation and relationship between two core, consistent characters of the series, which is Agent 47 and Diana Burnwood, which, in my opinion, culminated in the events of Hitman Absolution, which I'll get to shortly. So, the character of 47 has been a central aspect of the story to a greater or lesser degree throughout the entire series. From the outset of the first game, where you have the option to save Lei Ling, I think her name is, during the Hong Kong missions, to whether you choose to execute or simply incapacitate guards or civilians, there's always been an ambiguity and player-determinant element to 47's moral compass, which makes him an intriguing and enigmatic anti-hero, with more depth glimmering beneath the surface, of what would otherwise be a blank slate assassin. Indeed, his origins as a genetic clone bred, at the experimental whims of a scientist, and subsequently developing free will, has strong similarities to the creature in Mary Shelley's Victorian novel Frankenstein. And in both instances we have a creature who is made for a designated purpose, but goes rogue, rebelling against its creator, and later developing independent, inquisitive, and positive ideals about what it is to be human. A prime example of this is that in Frankenstein, the creature identifies companionship as a human necessity, and later expresses remorse at discovering the deceased Dr. Frankenstein. By comparison, in 2002's Hitman Silent Assassin, we find 47 enjoying the basic fulfilling pursuits of tending a monastery garden with, growing plants and flowers, classically indicating that he's nurturing life rather than being this harbinger of death. In the opening of this game, he also expresses to Father Emilio that he's not of this world and has killed out of ignorance and evil, which shows a basic cognitive awareness that he can distinguish right from wrong and good from evil. And the fact he's questioning this shows he's not this kind of, again, a blank slate, completely sociopathic assassin. So on this note, some players have found the monastery arc of Hitman 2 somewhat contradictory because later instances show 47 return to this ruthless, somewhat sociopathic demeanour and an emotional blank slate. But I think it's worthwhile, it's a worthwhile aspect of narrative and story to his progression that, admittedly it may have benefited from coming slightly further on down the line, because he does go from seeking atonement in the second game to being doubly murderous in Blood Money and subsequent titles, which either retcons or slightly undermines the actions of the second game, rather than showing a consistent narrative arc of 47's emotions and intentions. Now, having said this, it's prudent to note that Blood Money ends on a rather redemptive Christian metaphorical note about rebirth, with 47 being resurrected and shooting up a funeral congregation to the tune of Schubert's Ave Maria, which, digressing slightly actually, I think this theme song somehow really worked with this game and this particular game moment. But what we also see in the events, and even in the title of the next game, Hitman Absolution, it does maintain this idea about salvation and being absolved. So looking at it broadly, Hitman 2, where he's working in a monastery, Hitman Blood Money, we see this kind of resurrection arc, and Hitman Absolution, which again, absolution by its very name, the definition of that word, is a Christian notion of forgiveness of guilt or sin. So then, 47's always had this underlying third dimension to his character, which is this subtle pursuit of some form of salvation and escape from his past actions, and indeed his origins. In recurring instances, and looping back around to my earlier point, we turn to the second important character in Hitman, which is this relationship to Diana, who is his handler, and some would probably say, friend, as the series progresses. And she is this humanising element to 47's personality, and a sounding board from which we glimpse his more conversational and emotive side. As I mentioned, Hitman Absolution shows this relationship reaching a crescendo, with 47 having to make a decision about whether to betray his relationship that he's fostered with Diana by assassinating her, or betraying his employers by sparing her. And, as I've mentioned, Absolution is a very fitting title because ultimately 47 goes against this indoctrination of remorseless killing that he's been made and raised to do, and instead saves both Diana and the child Victoria, who Diana has saved from the agency's conditioning program as well. So, turning to the more recent instalments, the 2016 Hitman game shifts gears from this more emotive relationship, although it does feature moments, such as the prequel segment, where we have Diana vouching for him and taking responsibility for his employment at the agency, indicating from the very outset that she has this degree of faith in him. But what's interesting about this is 47 and Diana are both somewhat outsiders looking in from the very outset, because we hear Diana's employers telling them that they're not convinced about 47, and later, of course, the same employers, try and get 47 to assassinate her. So their faith is consistently with each other and between themselves, rather than any external forces, including the very agency that employs them. And as I alluded to earlier, this is the point of intrigue across each game, and trying to grasp 47's emotions and intentions, and the development of his character here is really quite interesting, because he is this blank slate, both emotionally and aesthetically. He's average in terms of height and weight. He has no hair. He has no distinguishing features of anything particularly, and he even talks with a very monotonous, monotone blandness that offers no real insight to his thoughts or feelings. So I think this is a really appropriate reflection of his emotions and his profession as a cold killer. And it's only really Diana that manages to chink this armour over the course of the series. Now, returning to narrative arcs, the reboot, or rather the retitling of the series, because I don't think it's officially a reboot, but we've seen the introduction of the shadow client, Lucas Gray, enter the scenario. And this is something of a retcon to the original story, although it still hinges around Ort-Meyer's experiments and 47's origins, at an asylum. And it signifies, I think, the next definitive chapter of the series, which has dawdled around this idea of Diana and 47 for a long time, only occasionally introducing some minor single appearance characters such as Birdie, but it's never really taken a concerted step forward with another character to help develop 47 and the game that we're playing. So the character of Lucas Gray and his emergence as a sibling, I think it's a really interesting next stage of development for Hitman, which although I'm going to leave it off here, I'd be very interested to see where this series is taken and how it develops further. So again, this video was short and sweet, but again, I just wanted to, post my thoughts and some observations on, this fantastic Sandbox series and how they've managed to broadly maintain this interest by such an ambiguous and, multifaceted anti-hero, I suppose we could call him. So, what are your thoughts? Drop a comment, start a conversation. And if you like what I'm saying, as always, please share and subscribe to help my channel grow.